Hello and welcome to the WriteCome.com podcast, where we help you to make money from your words. Each episode will be sharing tips, tricks, and strategies you can use to make more money from your writing, publishing, and marketing to your fans and audience. Let's get started with your host, Barry J. McDonald.
Hi, this is Barry here, and you are very welcome to today's podcast episode from WriteCome.com. And today's podcast episode is entitled, There Are No Defining Moments. Now, that quote had come from the great Peter Dinklage. I think he gave it at a commencement speech at some high school or university. And why am I talking about defining moments? Well, about a week ago, I was just looking at the podcast stats, and I just said to myself, you know something, I'm coming up to the 300th episode of this podcast. And I was just thinking, is there any advice I could give somebody in that 300th episode? Is there any defining moments? Is there something that I can point out and say, you know something, this was the big change in this podcast. You know, if you listen to such and such an episode, maybe episode 45 or episode 269 or whatever, if you listen to that episode, you will notice how I've got better on the podcast, or this thing has changed, or that thing has changed. And unfortunately, when I was just thinking about that, what advice or whatever I could give over to you, there has been no real defining moments. And stupidly as well too, I did look at the podcast stats today, and I actually blasted past episode 300. I think this is episode 304 or 305 or something like that. So I missed my opportunity to do that. But let's just pretend that this is episode 300. And as I said, you know, there are no defining moments. I can't look back at this podcast at any time and say, you know, this is where it all got better, because it's been a slow and gradual process. You know, every podcast episode has built onto the next one, it's built onto the next one, built onto the next one. And I'm going to find that with my audience. You know, first of all, I probably had one listener to this podcast, then probably I'm going to have two, maybe three, maybe four, and maybe it might double up over time. You know, maybe it might snowball or whatever. But there's no moment where I can actually look at defining a moment. You know, unfortunately, a lot of us, when we are looking to start something, when we are looking to write a book, when we're looking to start an online business or whatever, we're all looking for those kind of burning bush moments, something where, you know, it's going to stop you in your tracks and make you pay attention. It's going to kind of slap you in the face. It's almost like the clouds are going to part and this golden light is going to shine in your window and it's going to shine in your laptop, and this is going to be the day that you are going to write the first page of your book. You know, your book is going to start from that day onwards, because that is your defining moment. And unfortunately, there is no defining moments. Unfortunately, a lot of people go from the cradle to the grave waiting for those defining moments, waiting for that kind of Disney moment when everything is going to be perfect. The kids are going to be able to, you know, moved out of home and everything is going to be perfect. They're going to have time, they're going to have the right laptop, and they're going to have this is going to be perfect and that's going to be perfect. And then they're going to write the book, or then they're going to create the online business, or whatever. They're going to do this and they're going to do that. And unfortunately, as Peter Dinklage said, there are no defining moments. He probably can't look back and say, well, you know, this was a moment when my acting career turned around. Now, you can probably look back now and probably say, well, maybe the Game of Thrones TV show was the kind of thing that, you know, put him in the spotlight and made the whole world aware of his acting skills. And maybe he can do that. But in my own podcast, you know, I can't look back at any defining moments at all. The only things I can probably look back is it's probably the very first day I recorded this podcast, and probably maybe the last day I gave up on this podcast, or I ever step away from it. Those would probably be almost like the book ends to this podcast. Those are two concrete moments when I can look at my first episode and listen to it and say, God, I sounded terrible in that. And then maybe listen to the last podcast I've recorded and say, God, there's some change in that. Well, at least I hope there's going to be a few changes from my very first episode until then. But when you're actually in the middle of something, because you are showing up every day, you don't actually really notice. It's just almost like you are like a tortoise. You're just inching along, you know, one episode on top of another episode on top of another episode. And that's the way you build your podcast. That's the way you build your books, is one page after another. You know, your online accounts, your blog, it's one blog article after another, or, you know, whatever it is you are looking to do. It's slow progress over and over and over again. And there's never going to be a defining moment when you are going to, you know, say probably to yourself that, well, this is the moment when I became a writer, or this is the day my online business. Now, there may be some concrete point, maybe if Netflix bought up the rights to your book or whatever and made a TV show out of it, well, then that probably could be a defining moment. But that doesn't happen to too many people. And unfortunately, if you are waiting around for a defining moment to start something, you're probably never ever going to do that. So if I was going to pass on any advice to you at all after doing 300 episodes of this podcast, maybe you can look back at my content and maybe you can say, well, this is the moment the podcast went in a different direction, and maybe it got better at this point, or maybe it got worse at this point. But maybe you can point that out because you're actually outside the bubble. You're not in the creative bubble that I'm in, and maybe you can see things that I can't see. But inside the creative bubble, I can't see any, defining moments at all. So maybe if I was going to pass any advice on to you, is that, if you are looking to do something right now, there's no reason why when you stop listening to this podcast episode, there's no reason why you can't turn on your laptop right now and write the first page of your book. Or there's no reason why you can't pick up your smartphone right now and record the first episode of your podcast. Or there's no reason why you can't turn on, the YouTube app, turn the camera on yourself and give some tips or tricks, or do a Facebook Live or anything like that. If you are waiting for the right moment to record that YouTube video, if you're waiting for the right moment to record that Facebook Live or whatever, unfortunately, you're always going to be waiting for that moment, and you'll just look back, your life will just fly by, and it'll be too late. You'll never have a chance to take action. So if I was going to give you any advice on the 300 episode, it would be get started right now, even though you're not experienced. I was reading in a book the other day that said, get started before you're ready. And I thought that was great advice, because I was never ready to do this podcast. If I had have thought I was ready, if I had sat by and said, well, I need to read this book, or I need to watch these videos on YouTube before I start recording this podcast, I'd probably still be watching those videos. I'd probably still be writing those books, and I wouldn't be on episode 300. So in that case, I would probably say, yes, start before you're ready. Write your novel now before you even think you're a writer. Record that podcast episode now before you even think you're a podcaster. Or record that YouTube video right now, even though you don't think you're qualified, or you're not good looking, or the knowledge you're giving across in that video is crap or whatever. Get it done and get it dusted and get it in the can. And you will find over time you will get better. And maybe you will find some defining moment. But when you're in the creative process, when you're in this kind of bubble, as I said, it's a slow thing. You're just inching along, and there's never ever any moment that I can say, this is the time when my podcast turned around. But because I don't notice it, because as I said, there are no defining moments. So if you are waiting around for those defining moments, don't. Get started right now. If I was going to give you any advice at all from this 300 episode, even though it's the 304th or 305th, it would be get started and ditch that thought that you need a defining moment. So as always, if you'd like to reach out to me, if you'd like to follow along with me and see where we go in this podcast, will there be any defining moments in the future? Who knows? But if you subscribe, you'll be the first to know all about it. So again, if you like this episode, if you'd like to share it with anybody, or if you would want to reach out to me, if you want to send an email to barryjmcdonald@gmail.com, or if you'd like to know what I do over on the Writecome site, which is help people burst those mental bubbles they have in their heads where they don't believe that they could be a writer, fiction writer, non-fiction writer, or blogger, whatever. If you want to go over to Writecome, that's WRITECOME.com. You'll find a lot of content over there, or you'll find it on Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, or whatever. So as always, thanks for sharing your time again today, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today. If you'd like more from the Writecome.com podcast, be sure to subscribe now for more tips, tricks, and ideas you can use to make more money from your words. See you in the next episode.